Welcome to the Forest School Podcast, a show where I, Lewis, and my co-host, Wem Southerner, set out to explore a shared pedagogy. It's a space where cerebral thinking matters more than craptivities, where educational purpose outweighs pretty resources, and where inclusion is more than just a buzzword. Join us as we overthink the trivial, deep dive into whatever sparks our dopamine, and reflect on what it means to truly hold space for others, holistically and without judgment. Thanks for being here. We hope you enjoyed this episode. I think that's the start of the podcast. Is you just going, Lewis, you don't need anything weird. Yeah. Stop.
I was literally going to say that. You don't need a little song. You don't need an anecdote. You don't need a weird fact. You don't need anything that you've been reflecting on, because this podcast has enough content without us being weird at the start. That's what I'm going to say. Okay. So
I should be incredibly normal. Welcome. Hello, everybody, to the normal show.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. This episode, we are chatting with Dr. Shelley Newstead, and we're talking all about Playwork. We're talking about the history of Playwork. I mean, she is the person to speak to about this, right? Because she's done a PhD all about the history of Playwork, going right back into the archives, finding out about the origins of Playwork in the UK and in Denmark, and then she tells us about how she's developed a model of Playwork called PARS, and talks about the training that she offers and what kind of Playwork means today. And there's a couple of like little books that she's talked about that I've written down. I want to find out relationship between Playwork and Forest School. It's juicy, listeners.
So good. If you're into the Playwork vibe, if you're into the Playwork scene, this is definitely one for you to get your teeth into. Yeah, that's it. We don't need to say any more, do we? We can crack straight on. Thank you to everybody that's supporting us on Patreon. Send us emails, admin@theforestschoolpodcast.com. We really like hearing from everybody. Enjoy the podcast. Bye.
Bye-bye. Listeners, we are here with Dr. Shelley Newstead. Thank you for joining us, Shelly. We're here to chat with you a bit about Playwork. I'm very excited to have this chat with you. We've met once before, haven't we, and talked about play when I was like looking at doing a PhD, and we had a really great chat. So I kind of wanted to invite you back really to focus a whole episode on Playwork, on a bit of the history about Playwork, about the current state of affairs, what you do yourself. I think a lot of our listeners will be quite interested in the overlaps between Forest School and Playwork, and sort of play specifically in the UK now, actually, and beyond, because I know you do some work internationally as well. So would you start by telling us a little bit about your career up to this point and your current work?
Yes, thanks for having me on. I always laugh when people ask me about my career, because it sounds like I planned it. And like a lot of things in Playwork, stuff just happens, you know. And so I have always been involved in, right from when I was a sort of teenager myself, I've always been involved in working with young people and children. I was in scouting, guiding and all that sort of thing, and then went on to leadership and that sort of thing. And when I went to university, I did a degree in English and German, which has got nothing to do with anything, to be honest with you, except that as part of my university experience, I discovered Playwork because I was involved in the Students' Union. I was a RAG sabbatical for a year, and got involved in play schemes and came to Playwork through that route, and didn't really think anything of it. It was just sort of a student holiday job, you know how it goes. But then after my degree, which wasn't very much used for anything, I then sort of went back into community work, charity fundraising, community development work with various national organisations. But then the 1990s initiative for what we now know as wraparound childcare came in. And people started saying, Shelly, you're really good at this stuff. Can you, do some training? And basically went self-employed as a result of that, set up Common Threads Playwork as it is now. And then sort of didn't look back. It's just been a case of one thing happening after another, really. And then about 10 years ago, no, longer than that now, a bit longer than that, I decided that I wanted to do a PhD. I was very fortunate. I'd met with an academic at Keele University, actually, who was involved in a lot of work I was doing in schools, looking at the role of the adult supervisor in lunchtime with play in schools. And she sort of got involved a bit in the work and said, "There's PhD in here, you know." And I thought, well, never thought about that. So another one of those sort of serendipitous events, and found myself doing a PhD at the Institute of Education with Professor Peter Blatchford, who's actually a professor of psychology and education. And I think it was probably a bit of a shock to the system to have a play worker on board, because clearly we have a bit of a different approach to things from psychology and education. But I was really lucky because I was allowed to explore things from a playwork perspective. Sometimes when you do PhDs, you get molded to what your supervisor is interested in and how they do things in their discipline. And I was actually very lucky to be able to explore what it means to do playwork from a playwork perspective, taking a playwork approach to it. So, yeah, so I came out with a Doctor of Playwork, which is again testament to IOE's sort of very supportive approach about developing knowledge that's fit for purpose in helping adults to work with children. So, yeah, I had a great experience, although it did take me 10 years, which was, you know, a bit of a mission.
Can I ask you, just picking up on something you said there, can you, for those listeners who maybe don't know that much about playwork at the moment, I'm interested in you kind of calling this from a playwork perspective, which is very different from an education or a psychology perspective. How would you define a playwork perspective? Because some of us, I think, will know what you're on about, and other people will be like, well, what is that? What does that mean?
Yeah, and that's a hugely interesting question. And that's really went to the heart of my research question. What does it mean to do playwork from a playwork perspective? Because when I was teaching and training playwork and having been a playwork practitioner myself, playwork was very much a sort of collection of ideas, concepts, theories, but some of those were already in use or also being used by other professions and other disciplines like early years and youth work. Absolutely great, fine. But it wasn't very clear what was very unique about a playwork perspective when, you know, we talked about that. And it was more of a case of, well, you know, those who are in the know, and those who don't. You know, you either get it or you don't, sort of thing. And obviously, if you're trying to build a profession and, you know, professionalise a workforce, then that isn't hugely helpful. We need to be a bit more sort of articulate about that. So what I did was I went back into the original literature of the adventure playground workers in the UK and abroad, where it originally started in Denmark. And I was looking for any sort of clues that it gave me about, well, what is this playwork perspective? What does it mean to do playwork from a playwork perspective? Yeah, how did the Adventure Playground pioneers talk about their practice, the theory that went behind it, and what that meant in practical terms in working with children? And so I ended up reading hundreds and hundreds of primary sources that the Adventure Playground pioneers wrote. And they wrote stuff down in the weirdest of places. It was a bit like sort of the equivalent of, you know, being in a pub and having a good old chat, because on the one hand, you've got, you know, a personal letter between two people involved in adventure playgrounds that actually went into great depths about, you know, why these places existed and what the adults did and what they didn't do. And on the other hand, you had funding applications where they talked about the difficulties of working with sheep. It was sort of one of those very random sort of processes where, you know, there was data everywhere. And yeah, I guess people, you know, say, why did it take you 10 years, Shelley? Well, that's one of the reasons. Stuff everywhere. And what it became very clear to me was that through that process, it wasn't really as much as about play as it was about children. So I did something called grounded theory. And what grounded theory tells you is don't look for what you know. Yeah, because what you know might be situated in your current context, within your current situation, within your current sphere of knowledge. See if there are possibilities and potentials for theory that actually is outside of your normal sphere of knowledge, outside your comfort zone. And what I found was that the Adventure Playground pioneers were not talking about play. They weren't talking about how fantastic play is for children. Actually, they did everything they possibly could to keep out of the way of children's play and let them get on with it. But what they were interested in was this idea of childhood being different to adulthood, and children having different needs and different perspectives from adults. And they were incredibly radical. So they basically challenged the sort of adult child order of things when it came to children's free time. Now, they weren't that radical. They weren't saying, you know, children should rule the world and adults are bad. They weren't saying that. But the first adventure playground was created by Sorensen, Carl Theodor Sorensen. No, he didn't create it. I beg your pardon. He invented the idea of an adventure playground. And the reason he did that was because he was involved in moving populations from the rural areas of Denmark into new towns and cities. He was an architect. He was designing new towns and cities. But what he said was, well, this is great for the adults, but it's not so great for the children, because when the children lived in the rural areas, they could go out by themselves, unsupervised, do their own thing, move from place to place. Now we've moved them into the towns and cities, they're always under the gaze of adults. And adults don't necessarily want them to light fires in the middle of the nice park or dig a hole or, you know, poke an animal or two. And adults are always going to be there saying, don't do this, and regulating children's time and how they spend their own free time. So Sorensen came up with this idea of what he called a skrammelageplatz. Terrible Danish pronunciation, sorry. And it was just a little sort of marked out space in the middle of these urban environments where kids should be able to go and do their own thing. And the original adventure playground didn't have any adults on them. When Sorensen invented this idea, he said no adults. So what that made me realise, having been, you know, teaching about, you know, the importance of play and how Playwork was all about facilitating play. Some people know I wrote the Busker's Guide to Playwork and defined Playwork as the art and science of facilitating play. But as a researcher, I was finding out something completely different, which was actually the kids were talking, the Adventure Playground pioneers were talking about kids. They were talking about childhood. They were talking about the need for children to have opportunities to be children and to have time and space to do what matters to them for their own perspectives, not necessarily from the adult perspective. And so it was really radical. Because what the adults who ran the adventure playgrounds were saying was we should be leaving children alone more to do their own thing. We're not here to help them to play, because actually they can play. They know how to do that. That's part of their culture. But also in adventure playgrounds, they wanted to do lots of other things. They wanted to mend their bikes. Yeah, they wanted to raise money for Mrs. Jones's wallpaper over the road because she didn't have any wallpaper on her walls. So the kids took it upon themselves to, you know, fundraise for Mrs. Jones's wallpaper. They developed their own newspapers. They developed tuck shops, and Joe Benjamin writes about the cop shops. So the kids would have their own system of justice and put each other in jail if, you know, if things went a bit pear-shaped on the adventure playgrounds. So this idea of, you know, play work equals play is actually quite a modern invention that came in the 1970s and 1980s. Going back to the original playground, adventure playground literature, made me realise that what a Playwork perspective is actually about is about children and about childhood.
That's
Yeah.
That's so interesting. Can I ask what era are we talking about? If you're talking about Sorensen and these first adventure playgrounds and the idea of it, when was that?
So Sorensen wrote a book in 1931.
Wow.
Called something quite unmentionable in Danish, I'm afraid, for a non-Danish speaker. It wasn't translated into English. But what happened was that Lady Allen of Hertwood, Marjorie Allen, went over to Denmark. She only was on a refueling stop in those days where, planes have to stop and refuel. She was going to Norway to an OMEP conference, I think. And somebody met her on the tarmac and said, I say, Marjorie, you're interested in children. Come and see this amazing place out at Emdrup, which is a suburb of Copenhagen, and took her out to see the adventure playground. Now, she came back and wrote an article for the Picture Post in 1946. And the title of that article was, Why Not Use Our Bomb Sites Like This? And every time I read that title, that's the accent I hear it in, right?
Yeah.
Because I can just hear her character in that title where she, is telling people, come on, let's do something positive for our children. And she was a great orator. She went round and did town hall speeches, and she wrote pamphlets, and she got this idea out of children needing something other than the fixed playground equipment, swing, slide, roundabout, based on the model that she'd seen at Emdrup. So 1946 was the first Picture Post article. But then what happened, and this is interesting, I've interviewed several people who were around at this time and knew Lady Allen of Hertwood. And my question is always, what was she like? And they said to me, well, we don't know, dear. Never met her. We read a pamphlet that she wrote, or we heard her at a town hall, or we knew somebody who knew somebody. And then we thought, well, we could do this. What a great idea. Adventure playgrounds. How hard could it be? And they all went and set up adventure playgrounds in their local areas. So from then, it all sort of, developed from that sort of 1946 Picture Post article, I guess, and really by word of mouth.
That's
And then
incredible for it to have
Playwork
been
came in
so
about
decentralized so early. You would have thought with a lot of these ideas, they're kind of, lots of people try and hold on to those things, don't they? And go like, well, this is our thing and we're going to keep it and we're going to really dig in deep. But that sounds like it was, very like grassroots and very kind of like the ownership is immediately spread out.
Absolutely. And of course, there's advantages and disadvantages of that, because one of the downsides that the Playwork field has certainly suffered from over the last however many decades we've been around is that there's an awful lot of reinventing the wheel going on. Yeah.
What do you mean by, could you tell me more about that?
Well, so for example, in her autobiography, Lady Allen says, well, there was 2 adventure playgrounds that started up within a mile of each other in London, and they didn't know about each other's existence.
Right.
Now, what that means in practice is that although that's great in terms of community provision and developing local knowledge and localising the adventure playground to meet people's needs, the adults who are involved have to go through their own cycle of learning about what it means to run an adventure playground. So knowledge that could have been used from one adventure playground to inform another and save people some time and energy elsewhere was actually just being relearned and rediscovered rather than passed on. Now, the adventure playground pioneers were actually aware of that, and they commissioned some academics in the 1960s to do some studies. They encouraged people to write stuff down. There were a couple of books published. Jack Lambert, 1974, was published by Penguin. Pat Turner's Extraordinary was published in 1961. But largely, the knowledge about what it means to do adventure playgrounds, and then subsequently what it means to do adventure playgrounds, has almost been passed on by word of mouth, if it's been passed on at all. Certainly, and some of that still continues today.
Yeah, that's so, and I think that we can see that today, as you're saying, about, people who going back to what I said earlier, people who know about Playwork know about it and are passionate about it, but so many people don't know about it, and it's actually quite hard to discover. You know, when I was starting out in forest school and became really interested in just like the play element of forest school, trying to research play and Playwork, I'd sort of spent ages trying to research before I stumbled across Playwork myself. You know, if you're not aware of it, then I sort of feel like it has. I'm interested to know why that is, and sort of the journey really, because there have been times where Playwork has been more in the public eye and been better funded. Am I right? And then sort of periods of time where it's a bit more trendy, and then it's gone off the radar. And I wonder if that is because of this sort of grassroots nature of it, that it is quite sort of political in its way of not being not sort of subscribing to the main sort of political agenda and being a little bit like anarchic and underground, and therefore hasn't had that standardization process, which in some ways is really great, but in other ways means that it has the danger of sort of disappearing. What do you think about that?
Yeah, and again, it's something that sort of interested me in my PhD, because although I didn't set out to create a model of practice, I was literally just researching into what this idea of a Playwork perspective was. I did end up creating a model of practice to finish off the PhD, really. And it was a conceptual framework, and it was there, and it was just a nice way of finishing the PhD and saying, well, the question was, what does it mean to do Playwork from a Playwork perspective? If it looked like anything, this is what it would look like. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so the model I created has a philosophy, it has theories, it has techniques, and it has methods in it. And it was just designed as a way of sort of wrapping up all of that knowledge about how the adventure playgrounds articulated their practice and their ideas behind that practice. But the interesting thing was that while I was doing my PhD, I was also teaching Playwork in Hong Kong. And so I was trying out bits of the model to almost make sense of it in my own head. Yeah. Can I explain it? Does this have validity nowadays? Can I talk to people now about what the adventure playground pioneers were describing 50 years ago? Does it still have some relevancy in a context, and also in an international context?
Yeah.
Because
how did you end up in Hong Kong? Do you mind if I ask? How did you?
Oh, that's a long story. That's another podcast. Okay. Because one of the things for me that we've never really been able to do in Playwork, and for me does have a sort of solution in terms of why Playwork isn't perhaps as advanced in terms of its presence in the social understanding and professionalisation and things, is, for me, it goes back to this idea of articulation. That if you can't explain something and why you're doing it in a certain way, then actually everybody else is always going to have a better argument, right? So the teacher who doesn't want chalk on his playground is always going to be able to outdo somebody who just says, well, it's doing no harm, is it? Yeah. Now, if you can talk to the head teacher in a professional language that involves, intervention and affordances and lots of different other, technical language, then it does actually sound like you know what you're doing. Because the danger with Playwork is people look at Playworkers and go, well, you're not doing anything, are you? Yeah. Or you're just playing with children. And if you can't actually explain that, what you are doing, then actually there is nothing to professionalize. There is nothing for people to value and respect. Yeah. So when I was testing out this model in Hong Kong, people were saying, well, this works. And they were going back to their settings in places like Australia and Shanghai, and they were coming back to the training and saying, but Shelley, the model works. And it works because we can tell other people what Playwork is about. And the aim of the PARS model eventually became to articulate, develop and evaluate your Playwork practice. So what the PARS model does is it helps adults to explain what they're doing to other adults usually and why. doesn't talk about children. We don't talk about children's play in PARS Playwork, because actually, going back to what the Adventure Playground workers were talking about, you know what? Children don't need adults to play. They do it as part of, who they are naturally. What they do need is for the adults to be able to explain that when we are adults in their time and space, what it is we're doing and not doing in order to protect their time and space, particularly from adults who are prone to say, why don't you do it this way? Or don't do that, it's dangerous.
It's
Or
that
my own
advocating
particular
role, isn't
favourite,
it?
be careful.
Yeah.
So for me, it's that articulation that's really important. And that's been the missing link, I think, over the last 70 or 80 years, that there's been a lot of playwork theory about play. And that's fantastic. Of course, play is important to children, but actually play is just one part of children's culture. There's an awful lot more to childhood than play. And there's an awful lot more than children want to do in their free time than just play. Yeah, some kids want to learn Mandarin. Some kids want to learn how to bake a cake. Some kids want to learn how a combustion engine works. Fantastic. If that's what floats their boat, then why shouldn't they be doing that in their free time if that's how they choose to spend their free time? So I think it's really important that adults who are allowing and enabling children to do things from their own perspective in their own time are able to articulate that and to explain it to other people. For me, that's what PARS Playwork is about. And that's slightly different to what we call traditional playwork in PARS, which focuses more on children's play and the need for children to play. But I think we see internationally that it's much easier if people can actually explain their practice. Particularly around this whole thing about, not doing anything, not intervening.
Yeah.
That's really crucial for people to be able to say, yeah, I know I'm not, but the reason is, I'm allowing the children to do things from their own perspective. And these are the methods and techniques and theories that I'm using. And once people can do that, they become much more confident. Yeah, they become much more, relaxed. So people often say, yeah, actually, and we didn't upset the head teacher because actually we could explain what we were doing. And so everybody just calmed down a bit. Yeah.
I really enjoy the look, though. I don't know if you have, maybe this is an area of research. I would like to have a name for the look that goes across people's faces when they say, maybe challenge me in, well, what are you doing? Or what can you tell me what's going on with that play? And the wall of theory and ideas of me going, well, this is why I've done that. And that's why that equipment's over there. And I've set this up like this and I've done that. And I want a name for the face of people as they go, oh, this is all okay. Because it goes from like, I think this guy might be just standing around to, oh no, he needs to stop talking. How do we make him stop talking? Because he's still going. He's still going. I need a name for that look.
But I don't know if you experience this, Shelly, on your training, or whether people are kind of drawn to come to training because they already kind of believe these things. But doing forest school in schools where you sort of get assigned a teaching assistant, so and so, you'll go and help out with forest school, don't you? So they haven't chosen to be there. They don't know much about it, and they have that, like, they've been teaching all day or they've been helping at lunchtime, and they're full of that. Don't do that. Watch that. Be careful. All the rest of it. And you have to try in quite a short space of time to explain to them what the ethos is and maybe what their role might be. And even myself, kind of moving from teaching to forest school, that kind of voice in your head that's like, you're not doing anything, you're not giving to the children, you're not like instructing, you're not, that voice in your head, and the voice of people is sort of supporting, and trying to quiet that voice and sort of, because don't you, instinctively, it's better if I don't do that. It's better if I step back. It's better if I observe, all these things. But it takes a while for that kind of message to filter through, because it's so anti the main messages of education and looking after children and all the rest of it. When you see people on training, do they struggle with that kind of transition, or do people find that quite easy because that's why they're drawn to come to your training anyway?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly easier to teach people if they've already got what we call the PARS mindset, yeah, about seeing the child as the child and actually, leaving all the other labels and agendas at the door and starting from where the child's at. I guess we get sort of three main sort of responses in PARS. Some people come with that mindset and they say, fantastic, this is what I've been looking for all my life. I found my people, but now I've got the language and the justification for it, and fantastic, thank you very much. But most of it I was doing already. Great. The second lot of people would say something like, wow, this is revolutionary. Nobody's ever told me I can do this before. And now I feel empowered and I'm going to change my practice and, I'm going to let my child jump on the bed. Yeah, we get a lot of that. PARS is used with parents as well. And we get some lovely, lovely stories like that. And there are a small group of people who, come along and go, you lot are barking mad. Frankly, I don't want anything to do with you.
I've tried to train people like that. Just got to hold your hands up sometimes, don't you? And just go, okay.
Absolutely. And those people make really good choices, because instead of trying to be a bad PARS practitioner, they go and be a really good teaching assistant, or a really good youth worker, or a really good girl guider, or whatever it is. And children need those adults with all of those different perspectives and outcomes and aims in their lives. I think one of the problems in Playwork has been that, we do tend to come across sometimes as, well, it's play or nothing, And actually that's not the perspective we take in PARS. It's that, children want to learn chess, they want to go and join the football club. They want to, I don't know, be the best badminton player ever or whatever. And they need adults with those skills and those knowledge to be able to support them. So, for us, if people say, no, really, PARS is not for me, we say fantastic, because actually then the right people will be doing the right sort of support for children in the right contexts. And there won't be that sort of mixed message, issue going on in individuals or in settings. So I think, we also talk about PARS hats. We talk about taking your PARS hat off and putting your teaching hat on. You can be both a teacher and a PARS practitioner, but just make sure you know what you're doing when. And don't try and use PARS in the classroom. It's probably not a good idea. In the same way as we say to parents, well, you can't be a PARS parent all the time, because kids would never go to bed. They'd never get fed, they'd never do the homework. and kids need all of those things. So we talk about, if you're a parent, for example, put your PARS hat on, have fun with your kids, allow them to have fun from their own perspectives, to do their own thing, to have unstructured time, to have a bit more freedom. But then, mealtimes are mealtimes and bedtimes are bedtimes, and then take your PARS hat off and put your parent hat on again. Yeah. And that's absolutely fine.
And sometimes the parents have got a whole, the parents are, for me, they're involved in that dynamic, and their needs are just as much. I think somebody, I can't remember if it's from somewhere, or maybe it was an analogy you might have used, where we were talking about if a kid's shouting, Playworking is getting them a megaphone, and but then reflecting that as a parent, sometimes you don't have the spoons to go, I can give someone a megaphone right now. You might need to go, actually, because of the day I'm having, or because I've been giving you a megaphone every day, all day so far. Now, in terms of balancing, I need some non-megaphone time, and that's equally valid.
Absolutely. And sometimes kids just need to put their shoes on and get out of the door to get to school on time, because they miss the bus, or because they get detention if they're not there, or whatever. At that point, as a parent, I'm sure as hell not going to be saying, oh, I wonder what would happen if you tied your shoelaces differently, which is what I do, as a Playwork practitioner. So, and so we're very clear to make those distinctions for people, because I think another sort sort of downside as play work is people have been taught to feel guilty if they're not, being play work all the time. And actually, that's just not feasible. It's not how the world works. The world has rules and boundaries, and kids need to learn those. And there are adult roles that equip them to do that. That's fantastic. It's just that when we're doing PARS play work, we take a more relaxed approach in life. But those rules and boundaries are valid. Yeah. And the other thing that people do struggle with is this idea of, well, we're just supposed to, let them do their thing, and we're not supposed to get involved. Well, that's not actually what I would call play work, because what the Adventure Playground pioneers were doing is they were making conscious decisions about when they needed to get involved and when they didn't. So in PARS, what the model of practice is actually all about is teaching adults to make those decisions about how and when to get involved through a range of different techniques and methods and using theories. And that is as important for us as standing back and doing nothing, or what looks like standing back and doing nothing. Because actually, we don't want kids to hurt themselves. It's not good enough to say, oh, well, everybody had a nice time and, nobody killed themselves today. It's not really a very responsible adult approach. We do need to step in sometimes. We do need to make sure that kids are not being seriously hurt or harmed physically or emotionally. But the question for us as PARS practitioners is, when and how do we do that? And that's quite a complex process.
Do you find with the training, the people that are coming on your training now, so because we were talking about those original kind of pioneers in the first few adventure playgrounds, and we were talking about people moving to towns and cities, and that they presumably those people would have had rural childhoods themselves, and they would have seen their children not having the same childhood as them, and so that's quite an easy thing to then be like, oh, this is different to my childhood, and so how can I recreate it in some way? But one of the things that always strikes me about play and about childhood now is that we're potentially many generations away from, in a family, you might be many generations away from somebody who had that rural, unsupervised play childhood. So you're potentially talking to adults about a type of play in childhood that they themselves may never have experienced, or may have only experienced in like fleeting moments. Do you find that at the time that you've been training, is that something that you have to factor into the training, people's personal experiences of childhood play? Is that changing over the years?
We try to avoid that at all costs in PARS, to be absolutely honest with you. I know it's a sort of popular technique, but actually I personally feel that a lot of damage can be done by asking people about their own play experiences in their childhood. Okay. I've certainly had people on training courses where I've seen that being done, and that's unlocked some sort of unfortunate memory that they hadn't really thought before. And the other reason that we avoid it in PARS is that I'm not really sure how relevant my childhood is to children nowadays, wherever they live, and wherever I work. I'm a middle-aged woman who had, white woman who had a very particular experience of growing up in rural North Norfolk. If I'm working with kids even in the middle of Norwich, which is an hour's, drive down the road, their experience of childhood now is very, very different from mine. So whether my experience was good or bad doesn't really make any difference, because actually what we teach in PARS is that we work with children in the here and now. And so it's the kids' experience that matters, not mine, if that makes any sense. What I need to focus on is, can I adopt a mode of practice like PARS, which actually enables these kids in front of me here and now to do things from their own perspective, in their own time and in their own space? And am I then prepared to be reflexive about whether my intervention is necessary or not? And in none of that is my experience of childhood or growing up in rural North Norfolk relevant. Yeah, it's about the here and now for us, both in terms of where the child's coming from and also where the adult's coming from.
That's really interesting, because I'm super interested in that at the moment, in terms of why, for example, a parent might choose to send their child to forest school or not, and how that might be sort of entangled with their own childhoods and their own hopes for their children's childhoods. And it's really interesting to hear you talk about it from that different perspective, that actually that's not relevant. It is about the here and now. And I think that's actually, there's something quite hopeful in that, rather than kind of being nostalgic about our own childhoods and kind of wanting our children to have elements that we might have had, or obviously avoiding elements that we might have had that were negative. That actually, to try to stop thinking that way and just think about the here and now and what's possible here and now. Because I think I definitely personally spend a long time feeling very sad about elements of childhood that I perceive now, like traffic, for example, that being such a huge impact upon children's childhoods, their free movement, the places they go, how they spend their time. And actually, I'm sad about it because it's different to when I was a child. It's one of the major differences. And if I had had everything the same in my childhood, except for the level of traffic that exists now, I would not have had the childhood that I'd had. I wouldn't have had that freedom. I wouldn't have had a lot of experiences. So I think, trying to kind of turn off that nostalgia and that mourning for things that are gone is probably quite healthy and hopeful. It's interesting.
Yeah. When I was a kid, the internet wasn't invented. Yeah. Never mind mobile, computing devices that you had in pockets that, told you all sorts of things you either need to know or don't know, or didn't need to know at a touch of a button. And that's what kids are dealing with nowadays, And so, so for me, it is the children's reality that's more important. No, that doesn't mean to say we don't put ourselves into the work in PARS. Of course we do. And we do recognise that our personal backgrounds, beliefs, cultures, whatever, have an impact on decisions about whether we get involved in children's time and activities, for good or for bad. And that's why we use reflexive practice, which is central to the PARS model, because reflexive practice, rather than reflective practice, is very much about our own personal feelings, our own influences, our own biases, our own perspectives, and how they influence the decisions that we make in terms of empowering children to make the most of their free time. So that's where we would then think, oh, that's interesting, because, I'm wishing the children would play like that, but actually that's more about my stuff than it is theirs. Yeah. So I just need to set that to one side and notice it. I'm not judging it, but, is it relevant to now? Possibly not. Or it might be, because it might be that the kids are thinking, oh, I wish I would remember that rhyme that my granddad used to hum, sing, when we were younger. And you could dredge it out of your locker and go, actually, I know that. Should I teach it to you? No, they can then say yes or no. Yeah. But your personal stuff then might actually be of use. So, it's really, really around using that reflexivity that's important to us, and being aware and conscious of the decisions we make and why that impacts and how that impacts potentially, the children in front of us.
I think that's everything you've just said is really relevant to me as a forest school practitioner. I think that applies absolutely to the forest school kind of ethos. And I'm curious to know how you see the relationship between forest school and Playwork, because there obviously are overlaps and similarities, and there are distinct differences. And I, for one, have been sort of victim to some real animosity between those two kind of factions, if you want to call it that, online, and it's very interesting to me. How do you personally, as someone who's come from that Playwork background, see the relationship between the two?
Yeah, I'm often quoted as calling forest school Playwork in the woods, which I mean, is a compliment, and it's a good thing as far as I'm concerned, because I think the similarities are around seeing as children as competent, and as curious human beings who actually want to get out and do stuff. It's just that actually sometimes the adults, have better ideas, or are too worried about risk, or what other people might think, and therefore put boundaries around children's curiosity and an innate ability to absorb the world around them, which we see in, as PARS practitioners all the time. So I think that idea of children as capable and competent, as curious, as naturally creative and exploratory and experiential and experimental human beings, I think is something that's certainly shared very much by PARS Playwork practitioners and Forest School practitioners. I guess where the two diverge in my mind, and I've only had third-hand experience of Forest School about what I've read and what practitioners have told me, but I suppose the major difference would be the outcomes. As in, in PARS Playwork, our outcome is for children to make the best use of their own free time from their own perspectives. Whereas, of course, Forest School has a very, is part of the school, is part of the educational system, and therefore has some, educational outcomes for children. I don't see that as a problem personally. I think that's great because, as I said, children need to learn. They need adults with certain skills who can help them to learn stuff that they can't learn by themselves. So, yeah, I'm sorry to hear you've had a negative experience there, Wem, because it's certainly not something that we would support in the PARS Playwork community. And in fact, quite a few of our trainers have done Forest School training as well,
I think
either
we're in the
before they
same
come to
boat,
PARS or after.
I think
Sorry, Liz?
I think we're in a very similar place. Like we were talking about that kind of like we were talking at the start about Playwork being that kind of like decentralized thing, and that being having pros and cons. And I think there's so much of that. Although Forest School has this thing, like the Forest School Association has done some work to try and go, these are maybe some guiding principles, but even within that kind of, even in the Forest School world, there are people who would be like, oh, playworking in the woods is 100% what I do. And then there would be people who would, both people would be calling their stuff Forest School, but there are people who'd be doing like craptivities and this week this half term we're doing Vikings because that's what the school says. And like there's this huge spectrum, and it's like so hard to put one dot on the map and be like, that's where Forest School is. And I feel like it sounds to me that your work is almost saying, well, it's a similar thing in playworking, in that you've got the absolutely anarchistic, don't get involved, don't even look at the children, don't make eye contact, you'll spook them, and they're like, I will set up loads of games and facilitate all the play and do all of the things. And so I think both practices have that difficulty of being like, when you've seen one dot on the map, you've seen one dot on the map, and then you'll go a little bit further on and go, oh, this is not the same as that other place that I saw. Which I like you say, I think there's pros and cons. I personally quite like it as a thing. I like having the freedom for things to kind of evolve as they go on. I think Forest School is evolving and branching in lots of different directions. I wonder if you feel like Playwork is doing a similar thing. Is it still evolving? Is practice now still being developed and refined? Or, how do you see it moving now into kind of like what we need here and today? Is it all coalescing, or is it branching out?
Yeah, I suppose I can answer that from two different perspectives, I guess, because from a PARS Playwork perspective, we have this huge international community with nearly 30 trainers now in something like 20 different countries, and we've taken Playwork and PARS Playwork into countries where it never existed. So where we go into new countries, we often have to translate. And that's a fascinating experience because we're literally making up foreign words.
Cool. Please tell me some foreign words you've made up.
Oh, my pronunciation is rubbish. But you can't direct translate some of the the language
Sure.
that we use as Playwork practitioners. So we have to have translation meetings where the speakers of that language all get together and go, it's a bit of that and a bit of that, and they're making composite nouns or new Chinese characters or
Amazing.
whatever, to create new vocabulary in their own language, which is amazing. So in terms of evolution, I mean, it's very, very exciting to see Playwork in the form of PARS Playwork going, international like that, and to be used in so many different settings and environments. People always look to the UK as sort of the leaders in Playwork. But I think there is a danger that from a UK perspective, from a sort of, traditional Playwork perspective, that there is an awful lot of reinventing the wheel, as I talked about at the start of this podcast. And I think, just picking up on what you said about, nostalgia, when there's, quite a lot of people who would love it if we could go back to the days of the National Play Strategy, and the great glory days, which weren't actually so glorious because an awful lot of that money actually went to fixed playgrounds and playground manufacturers. And we've just had £18 million launched in the budget for, guess what, 200 play parks in local authorities will be fixed up. And that breaks my heart, actually, because £18 million in community projects like play ranges, adventure playgrounds would go an awful long way. £18 million in fixed playground equipment does not go a long way. Most of it goes on safety surfacing and fencing, to be absolutely honest with you. And the play value to children is therefore, very low. So on the one hand, we've got Greenwich, adventure playgrounds all closing because to save £600,000. And on the other hand, we've got £18 million going into fixed playground equipment. And I have to say, it doesn't fill me with hope.
So interesting. This is so interesting because I'm seeing all these play strategies, everyone getting very excited about new youth strategies and the play strategy coming out and all this kind of stuff. And to actually look at it from that perspective and to see where it's actually going, because a lot of the stuff I'm reading at the moment does seem to be very linked to actually what you were talking about, the early days of adventure playground ideas around town planning and building. And it's like, we're building these new homes, we're building these new streets. Oh, let's think about kids though. Let's put a fixed playground there. And that it just seems to be a lot down that path, maybe because that's easy for people to understand. And I just don't,
There's definitely something in there that's like, if I'm being really cynical for a minute, I'll pull out like a soapbox for a second, which is that like, it's very easy to control and criticize the type of play that children do in those parks. There's a right way and a wrong way to use the roundabout and the slide and the whatever else. And if you're building a new, an extension to a town or, a new kind of development, it's very easy to then be like, oh, look, there'll be the type of play that's nice to look at, in all the air quotes in the world, right? Nice to look at over in this area. Whereas if you were to use the same area and go, even if I think if we used all of our like technical language and talked about play affordances and talked about kind of like access to these spaces, and the kids are going to run that, it's just about the visual side of it is not going to be as like curbside appeal, which is bullshit. But also that thing of like, it's way harder for adults to be like, well, should they be doing that? I can't really decide if this is right or wrong, but is that good playing they're doing in there? I can't quite see through all the palettes and shit. And like, that would be why I think that those people lean towards those fixed playgrounds. Whereas like we're saying, if you could just, the developer had to say, oh, we're building this many new houses, and so this little quarter of an acre here is for the local children, and they get to decide what happens, and we're going to set up a little, council of children, and they'll do all of that. It'd be way more beneficial to those children, but it wouldn't be beneficial. It would, but it wouldn't be beneficial to all the people buying houses. Do you know what I mean? That's why I put the soapbox away. There you go. It's gone now.
Yeah, and the bottom line is, like everything else in life, it's not a question of either or. Play parks have their place. You know, they're fantastic for parents to take smaller children to, and you know, they can offer play value to some children. But the problem with fixed playgrounds is that as children get older, the novelty wears off. And what we do know about kids is that they are neophilic human beings. They need new experiences. They need challenge. And what happens is, you know, when you've been down the slide 40 million times, then you try and invent other ways to go down the slide, which might include taking your skateboard up it and trying to come down on your skateboard.
Yeah,
and that's the bit that the adults don't like. But that's actually just part of childhood. That's part of being a kid, you know, and we should be saying, thank goodness, because at least they're doing their best to get more play value out of this fixed play equipment than burning it down. But no, the adults go nuts and say you shouldn't be doing that. That's bad behaviour, which is deeply unfair on the children. So, you know, those fixed play parks, they do have, you know, their place. I don't entirely agree with Lady Allen of Hurtwood, who said that they were, what did she say? An administrator's heaven and a child's hell. Is how she put it in her autobiography.
That sounds like great graffiti. You should go and spray paint that
absolutely.
on the side of the playgrounds. Get a Banksy stencil done.
I don't entirely subscribe to that point of view. I think that's a bit, you know, black and white. But if you're only talking £18 million, what I do know is you could get an awful lot more play value for children out of £18 million than putting it into 200 fixed play equipment. It's not even like they're new play parks either. You know, they're fixing up existing ones, from what I understand. And that's, you know, I do really worry about.
And in that budgeting going there as well, I always feel like there's a big gap in terms of play affordances for anyone over the age of like 10. You know, where we start to look at the types of play that preteens and teenagers are, that they need and that they want to engage in. And that is even more kind of like, oh, well, we don't want to see that. We don't want to encourage that. You know, we're going to make the playgrounds fully transparent so that there's no elements of privacy. And whereas, you know, one of the things that I really believe about playworking stuff that I've seen and that I've tried to implement is that it's just validating everything across the board, you know, validating what, within reason, within safety reasons, within laws and the, you know, moral guidelines. But, you know, those fixed playgrounds, like you said, can have some great play affordances for very young children, but they're not necessarily play affordances for teens and older. Do you have trainers, or do you kind of do the PARS stuff with preteens and teens? Is that stuff that comes up for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we tend to work with 2-3-year-olds upwards. And that was quite funny, because when sort of the PARS model originally sort of came into being, I was still thinking in terms of sort of the traditional playwork age range, which tends to be school age, and maybe sort of even a little bit younger than sort of 16 nowadays, you know, 14, maybe that sort of age. But quite a few of our trainers started to use it in kindergartens. So, for example, in Hong Kong, they had a huge initiative with lots of kindergarten schools taking on PARS training, because the government was encouraging education settings, particularly kindergartens, to provide free time during the curriculum day. And that wasn't being very well understood. So the play was still being very structured and directed by adult themes and, you know, adult sort of organisation. And the trainers saw an opportunity to embed PARS in the kindergartens across Hong Kong. And I remember saying at the time, isn't it lovely? I remember saying, good luck with that. I don't think it'll work. And they proved, because the model wasn't designed for working with younger children. And they proved me wrong, absolutely, by thousands of children saying that. It's great to be wrong sometimes. So, yeah, so we tend to work, PARS practitioners work with all ages. I mean, we've got, you know, teens on adventure playgrounds in Shanghai, building, you know, structures, and there's lots of different sort of projects going on that involve children who are, you know, almost adults actually.
Oh,
That's
amazing.
great.
Oh, thank you so much for chatting. I genuinely could sit here and chat
Yes.
play theory for hours and hours and hours, but I'm conscious of not taking up everybody's afternoons. Thank you so much. Dr. Shelley, where can people find out more about your work, and if people have listened to all of this and are interested in finding out more about playworking, are there any particular resources that you want to point people towards?
Yeah, I mean, come and join us at www.parsplaywork.com. We've got an online community. You don't have to even do PARS training. You can just turn up and sign in. We do CPD events as well. Some of those are free. Some of those are for small amounts of money if you haven't done PARS training, and connect with people across the world. It's a fabulous space, and with an awful lot going on. So very, very welcome.
Yeah. What does PARS stand for, please?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked me that at the end of the podcast.
I thought we were going to snip, and this is
It
going
does.
right at the start. Snip, snip.
Yeah. It's not something that, we usually tell people unless they've done the training, because it doesn't make a lot of sense without, actually understanding what the model is and how it works. But it does actually stand for the Playwork Action Research System.
Amazing.
Because we see practice, so in PARS, practice is conceptualized as action research to find out what these kids need in the here and now from us as adults. And so I suppose that's another difference between PARS and traditional play work. Whereas when you say play work, normally people would think of a space. Yeah, it's about providing a space. Whereas for us, PARS is a practice. PARS play work is a practice. It's something you can do anywhere. You can do it at school. You can do it in the airport. While you're waiting for your suitcases. You can do it at a hospital bedside. You can do it in an adventure playground. PARS is conceptualized as a practice that is about trying to find out how we can be, like Bob Hughes said, good guests in children's time and space. So that's why it's called the Playwork Action Research System, because it's us who's learning all the time. We don't have the answers. We don't have the knowledge. It's kids' time and space. They know what's best most of the time. Sometimes they do need a bit of adult knowledge and perspective, and that's when we use the PARS model to try and make those decisions about when that adult knowledge and perspective is relevant and when it's just us being bossy or oversensitive adults.
Yeah, and I guess that action research comes back into that reflexive element that you were talking about. It's just very cyclical and so juicy.
So good.
Thank you
so much.
Shelly.
This has been amazing.
Yeah.
Well, it's been lovely talking to you. Thanks for having me on, and talk again maybe.
That'd be amazing. Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.